On October 15, 1924, Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, stood to make a speech at the intersection of Mount Pleasant and 16th Street in our nation's capital. He was there to dedicate a statue of a horse and rider. People called it the 15th Horseman to Washington. The first 14 included military generals: Washington, Sherman, Sheridan, Scott, Grant, Jackson, McClellan, Hancock, Greene, McPherson, Logan, Pulaski, and Joan of Arc. The 15th was a preacher on horseback. His name, Francis Asbury. In this inspiring speech, the president remarked of him, in 1771, when he was 26 years old, responding to a call for volunteers, he was sent by Wesley to America. At that time, it is reported that there were 316 members of his denomination in this country. The prodigious character of his labors is revealed when we remember that he traveled some 6,000 miles each year, or in all, about 270,000 miles, preaching about 15,500 sermons and ordaining more than 4,000 clergymen, besides presiding at no less than 224 annual conferences. The highest salary that he received was $80 a year. But he left behind him, as one evidence of his labors, over 200,000 members of his movement. Who shall say where his influence, written upon the immortal souls of men and women, shall end? How many temples of worship dot our landscape? How many institutions of learning, some of them rejoicing in the name of Wesleyan, all trace the inspiration of their existence to the sacrifice and service of this lone circuit rider. He is entitled to rank as one of the builders of our nation. Today, at the quiet corner of Mount Pleasant and 16th, the silent statue still speaks. At the base of the statue reads a short inscription, some of the letters of which are now gone. It reads, "The Prophet of the Long Road." It's a prophetic sign for us who would take up this mantle and lay claim to this legacy in a still new century. In a manner of speaking, it's time to get back on the horse. The time has come for the prophets of the long road to ride again. It's time to sow for a great awakening.
The text for today's sermon is Psalm 44, verse 1. "We have heard with our ears, O God. Our fathers have told us what deeds thou didst perform in their days, in the days of old." The scripture lesson is from Hebrew 11, and it is verses 1, 2, 5, 7 to 10, and 13 to 16. "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the men of old received divine approval. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was attested as having pleased God. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events yet unseen, took heed and constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which comes by faith. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was to go. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in the tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked what cannot be shaken, looked forward to the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. These all died in faith, not having received what was promised, but having seen it and greeted it from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles upon the earth. For people who spake thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Thus ending the reading of the Scripture.
America is God's chosen people in the modern world to demonstrate his light to the world, a light of righteousness, compassion, and help for needy peoples, brotherhood of the races and the classes, and democracy. Ours is a fertile and wonderful country, and then we have built up a wonderful civilization in a relatively short time. And hither peoples from all around the world have come eagerly, and they still want to come. For America is seen to be the last best hope of men. America was founded by God-fearing people, and our nation has a great Christian heritage. And in the upbuilding of our country through the last 200 years, the Methodist Church has played a prominent part. The first Methodist preachers came over to America just before the Revolution in the 1760s. And John Wesley sent over several preachers, one of them the famous Francis Asbury. All through the trying days of the Revolutionary War, this little Methodist movement kept growing. And at the close of the war, there were nearly 15,000 Methodists in America. And John Wesley realized that these people would have to have a church organization in order that they might have the sacraments. And he sent Dr. Thomas Coke as his messenger to America. And the upshot of it was that the Christmas conference was held. All the Methodist preachers were called to meet in Baltimore on December 24, 1784. Some 63 preachers perhaps assembled here. The Methodist Episcopal Church was organized, and Asbury and Thomas Coke were elected bishops. And the preachers went forth with zeal to conquer a nation for Christ. One of their announced aims was to reform the continent. And next year we are to celebrate the bicentennial of that Christmas conference and all that it has meant to us. Bishop Asbury set the example for the early preachers. In 45 years, he traveled 275,000 miles on horseback, up and down the country, across the mountains, into the New West. And the early Methodist preachers, following the example of Asbury and Wesley, were called circuit riders. Most of them rode horseback over a large section of country, usually preaching every day in a different place. They preached in log cabins and homes, outdoors sometimes, schoolhouses, taverns, courthouses, and churches. They were out in the weather every day, facing the wind, the rain, the sleet, the snow, the summer heat on their horse. The circuit rider slept in a different house every night. He partook of the common food of the people. In his saddlebags, he had a Bible, a hymn book, and a discipline, maybe another book or two, and a few items of clothing. And so he went on his rounds. The early preachers lived a life of poverty. In 1816, the salary was raised to $100. $200 for a married man, $216 if they had one child between 5 and 14. But that didn't mean much because too often they didn't receive the salary anyway. In the fall of 1830, Elijah Pilcher arrived in Ann Arbor with 12.5 cents in his pocket. Peter Cartwright in 1806 was appointed to a hard circuit in southeastern Ohio, West Virginia. And at the end of the year, his horse had gone blind from the brush. His saddle was worn out. His clothes were patched and tattered. And he even had to give up for a while. He worked in another job, earned some money, got a horse, and appeared at conference, ready to ride again an adventure for the Lord. That was the spirit of the early circuit riders. The frontier was rough and tough. But now came the Methodist circuit riders. They preached with evangelistic zeal and fearlessness. Revivals broke out in many places. There was a place called Rogues Harbor down in Kentucky, where criminals and fugitives from justice had flocked in from all parts of the country, and they defied all law and order. But then the preachers came, and hundreds of people were converted, and their lives were lifted to a new plane, and the whole character of society was changed. Being a Methodist in the early days was a serious business, you know. John Wesley one time expelled 64 people from one society, 2 for cursing and swearing, 17 for drunkenness, 3 for quarreling and brawling, 1 for beating his wife, and thus it went. Methodists had no creedal requirements, but they were expected to be earnestly striving to live the Christian life. Methodism was called Christianity in earnest. The first Methodist preacher came to Michigan in the spring of 1804 and preached a few sermons in Detroit. Regular Methodist preaching began in Michigan in 1809. The first society was organized on the banks of the River Rouge in the fall of 1810. On March 31, 1818, the first Methodist church, a log church, was built on the River Rouge about 6 miles west of Detroit. In May 1825, Elias Pattee preached in Ypsilanti, the first Methodist sermon in Washtenaw County. In November, John Bauman preached the first Methodist sermon in Ann Arbor, in the home of John Allen, the founder. In the spring of 1826, William Simmons, the presiding elder, came out from Detroit over terrible roads to Ann Arbor and preached there and in Ypsilanti. He found the road desperately bad, but he had the pleasure of officiating at the wedding of 2 daughters of Deacon Maynard, who lived at Mallett's Creek between Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor. On July 29, 1827, a Methodist society was organized in Ann Arbor. In 1828, the Huron Circuit was established with Benjamin Cooper, circuit rider. 10 preaching points are mentioned: Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor, Dixboro, Superior, Boyden's Plains, Lodi Plains, the log church on the Rouge, Hickoxes, Nanking, and Plymouth, along with smaller settlements intermediate to these. And it took the circuit rider 3 weeks to go around these places. In the fall of 1830, the Ann Arbor Circuit was set up with 2 young preachers, Pilcher and Henry Colclasser. And I'm sure that they were preaching here in Dixboro. The circuit ran from Dearborn west to Dexter, and as the new settlements were formed, they finally got as far west as Jackson in January 31. In September 31, the Ohio Conference established 2 new circuits. Ypsilanti Circuit covered Superior and Salem townships and most of Wayne County to the east, and then to the west. The Tecumseh Circuit took in Ann Arbor, most of Washtenaw County, Jackson County, Calhoun County, Branch County, Hillsdale County, and Lenawee. And when that circuit was set up, they finally had a circuit of 400 miles with 27 preaching places. In September 1831, Alva Billings was on this Ypsilanti circuit. We're told he had 18 preaching points, and among them were Ypsilanti, Wayne, Dearborn, Redfield Center, Plymouth, Northville, South Lyons, Northfield, Salem, and Dixboro. It seems that by this time the Methodist Society must have been organized in Dixboro, but we have no record of this real beginning of the church. In 1851, the Michigan Conference planned an advance in this area, and it made 2 appointments to Ann Arbor. First church, Jonathan Blanchard. Second church, Manasseh Hickey. He was to work up a new Methodist work in Ann Arbor Town, or Lower Town, north of the river and the surrounding countryside. Hickey was a zealous old-time Methodist preacher. He built the Saline Church in 1857-58, and he built the Dixboro Church in 1858. 3 churches, all New England type, white frame architecture in 3 years. On December 9, 1858, 364 days after the town meeting, the trustees accepted the church as finished according to contract. It was ascertained that the church had cost $2,241. The debt remaining was $711. For the building of the church, 7 people had subscribed $100 each, which was a lot of money in those days. There were 75 subscribers in all. Quite a number of people had subscribed $50 each. Some Ann Arbor citizens contributed toward the furnishings, and the church began to be used and was dedicated. That year, Reverend Donaldson received a salary of $344 out of his claim for $409. The circuit had 2 churches valued at $3,600, 4 Sunday schools, and 725 library books for loan, 118 members, 35 probationers. We had a minister here from 1870 to 72 who was rather outstanding, James R. Corden. In 1871, the Dixboro Women's Foreign Missionary Society was organized and began its notable record with a contribution of $28. The pennies and nickels, the mite offerings of the women, who had little money in those days, amounted to a good sacrificial sum. This was only 2 years after the first chapter was organized in Boston. Corden, in the summer of 1872, put out a fine printed paper, 3 monthly issues sent to all the people of Superior Township. In the August issue appeared such articles as Search Out the Scriptures, King Alcohol, To Break Down a Church, etc. The old-time Methodist zeal against the liquor traffic was evidenced in his article on King Alcohol. He applauded his class of honor of 36 persons who had taken the following pledge: I do solemnly promise not to make, buy, sell, or use any intoxicating drink as beverage, and that I will not use profane language or tobacco. This, he said, we call our class of honor, for it is honor for anybody to refrain from evil and influence others to do the same. In a September paper, he said goodbye to the people of Dixboro and Free Church. He told that they'd had open houses for the people. They also had a party for the children on a Saturday afternoon, inviting the children to come, quote, to sing and play and enjoy ice cream and cake. His fine Christian spirit was displayed in these words: we bespeak a good word for the new preacher. We meet him cordially, pray for him fervently. The first time you shake hands with him, don't forget to leave a $1, $5 bill in his hand. He will feel that he's among a really sympathizing people and go to work right manfully among you. We shall be surprised if we don't hear glorious things from you another year. God will yet pour out upon you his blessed Spirit. Time fails me to tell the many things that I would like to tell you about. But one of the fine ministers of our church was Kalita E. Edwards, who served here from 1918 to 1921. The automobile age was coming in. The preacher drove a Model T Ford. The roads had not been improved much yet, and tires were bad. They didn't last long. People had many flats as they drove. Mrs. Edwards has written, the charge included Free Church and Northside Ann Arbor. In the spring, a freeze and thaw made the Free Church for country roads almost impassable. Deep ruts filled with water and then froze over, but not hard enough to sustain the car's weight. As it broke through, it cut the tires. And by the time Cal had reached Dixboro, all 4 tires were riddled. What to do? At morning prayers, we presented our problems to the Lord and left it there. In the mail that morning, 11 a.m., was a letter from a Masonic friend in Detroit saying he got to thinking about Cal and his new work and felt he'd like to help. So he went to the office of a mutual friend and told what he wanted to do, and ended by saying, "I have $50 I think Cal could use. Would you match it?" And from the envelope out dropped checks for $100. A farmer took Cal into Ann Arbor in his horse and buggy, where he bought 4 new tires for his Model T Ford. Cost $95.50. We felt like Ezra and Nehemiah, that the good hand of my God was upon me. So we thanked the Lord and took courage. Now this illustrates so well the faith and wonderful spirit of just one of the laymen of our church. I would love to tell you about some of the lay people of the church, some of the laymen that I knew in my ministry here over 40 years ago. Time fails me to tell of many things, such as the famous football dinners that snared many fans as they returned from Ann Arbor, from the university games, for the financial profit of the church. Our faithful men, how hard they worked. And time fails to tell of the rewarded faith of our laymen on the Lord's Acre projects following World War II. As we think of God's leaders in Bible times and our wonderful faith through Jesus Christ, our American heritage, the zeal and sacrificial devotion of Methodist ministers in this place for 155 years, and the hundreds of faithful men and women who have worshiped in this sanctuary here for now 125 years, our hearts fair burst with appreciation and joy and gratitude. Truly ours is a glorious spiritual heritage here. We should be inspired by those who have gone on before us to live worthy Christian lives in our day and generation, that the Lord's cause fail not from our negligence or neglect, that those who have gone on before us may see their work completed in us. May the fire and devotion of the early Methodists in this place fall upon us today. We have heard with our ears, O God. Our fathers have told us what deeds thou didst perform in their days and the days of old. These all died in faith, having confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Amen.
It's my pleasure to introduce the first of 2 speakers that we have for you this morning. 125 years ago, a week ago this past Thursday, the Dixboro United Methodist Church, for all intents and purposes, became very real. And about a year later, of course, the building was completed. So today starts the first in a series of several events to commemorate the anniversary of our church. Our first speaker this morning, as the saying goes, needs no introduction. Ivan Parker is our church historian. He will spend some time telling you a little bit about the church. He's too modest to tell you too much about himself, so I'm going to do that for a second. Born and raised here in Dixboro on a farm on Dixboro Road. Ivan has been a lifelong member of the church. He claims he has not been here 125 years, however, but can speak with a great deal of authority about a lot of our church history. He and his wife, Eleanor, have 3 children, 2 of whom are in the ministry. One, of course, is the associate pastor at First United Methodist Church in Ann Arbor. So, without further introduction necessary, Ivan Parker.
Morning. I look over this group, hope it don't put too many of you to sleep, because some of you may have heard parts of this talk. To give you a little idea, if you have 125 years and you spend 1 minute a year, which I plan to do, that'll take me 125 minutes, which is a little over 2 hours. And of course, you ought to spend more than a minute a year, and I probably could go on for 10 times that long, but I'd be out of voice, and I'm sure you'd be tired of sitting long before that. In being a historian, you often read about the good old days, and in going back and reviewing for this talk, I was thinking something about the good old days at Dixboro, or even before Dixboro was here. And I guess my big conclusion is how glad I am I don't live in the good old days, because they were not, in many ways, quite as good as we have it now. There was one or two things that came to mind, though, that I thought I would share with you before I start on this talk. Dixboro did have a post office. And in 1904, my grandfather, William E. Parker, drove his horse and buggy a mile to Dixboro and posted a letter to my father, who was at school in Detroit at that time. On the back of this envelope, it shows that by horse and buggy, that letter got to Ann Arbor at 3 o'clock that afternoon. And then it shows also that it got into Detroit at 8 o'clock that evening, and my father got it the next morning, and the cost was 2 cents. I have a sister who lives in Wyandotte. I write her a letter on Monday. Often she gets it on Thursday or Friday, because a lot of the mail has to go from Ann Arbor into Dearborn to be sorted or something, and then come back out and swing around, and it now costs 20 cents. I'm not sure we're 10 times as well off as we were post office wise, for local mail anyway. Now, air mail and other things are a different matter. I'll leave this on the table up here, so you like the stamp people. It's just an old 2-cent stamp with a bullet on it, if you know what that means. That was the way it was canceled. Among the keepsakes I have is a little folder made to put in a vest pocket, telling something about the Dixboro and free churches and their financial reports of 1896. I imagine the membership at that time was somewhere around 90 people here and about 60 at Free Church. I don't have the absolute records. But anyway, at that year, the pastor's salary was $300.61, and all the oats his horse needed. So that I don't know how many miles per. I don't know how many miles he got to a quart of oats, but anyway. The presiding elder received $18.62 for the year. The parsonage repairs came to $21.48. We paid our missionaries $24.90. We had Education Day, Children's Day, at a cost of $2.37, whatever we spent for it on that time. And there was a board, which my grandfather had part, to arrange to provide the wood to heat the church. And that they would go around the different farmers and attempt to get it either donated or sold at a price of $1 a cord. And those cords were 4 foot long. They were not the face cord that we see now when you want to get a little wood for your fireplace. And it says here, their goals for the year: 3, an increase of spiritual life in every member; 2, an increase in our church membership; 3, an increase in our giving. Some things do not change. I find I do better if I write things down, and I don't go on for too long. This program this morning is partly in recognition of the 125th birthday of the Dixboro United Methodist Church. I'm planning to tell you something about Dixboro, the church, and how it grew in just a few minutes as a background for more events in 1983, which will celebrate this 125th milestone. Dixboro was settled by Captain John Dix, who came from New England, where he spent most of his life on the sea. On May 19, 1824, he bought 3.5 sections of land from the government. On the September 28th that same year, he added another 56 acres. The prevailing cost at the time was $1.25 an acre. In contrast to the stony land in New England, he and others who came to this area were most impressed with the result that the township was named Superior. In 1826, he platted the village of Dixboro into 64 lots on Dixboro Road just north of Fleming Creek. 4 lots were designated to be reserved as a public square and were to house a school and a church. Dix had a store which had a post office, and he was the first postmaster. He also built a sawmill and a grist mill on Fleming Creek, south of the village. In fact, Dixboro prospered and soon had a second store, 2 taverns, and a blacksmith shop. At one time, it was quite a bit larger than its neighbor to the west, Ann Arbor. Dix and his wife were not very popular with their neighbors. They brought too many of the New England ways, and his wife was accused of shining deer, which was not looked on with all favor, as this meant you went out with a light and shot the deer when you brought them to them. About 1934, he decided his prospects was better, and he sold his holdings and moved to Texas. And there is some, if you want to read more about what happened to him, read Carol Freeman's book on Mr. Dix down in Texas. He had some hair-raising events, almost lost his scalp, but it's all there. A few years later, the New York Central Railroad followed the Huron River from Ypsilanti to Ann Arbor and west to Jackson. This left Dixboro sitting on its Fleming Creek, and a period of decline followed. In many ways, the village of Dixboro was quite complete, except for a church. It was served by a number of circuit riders who came through the area. In 1825, a Methodist church rider whose name was not recorded called at the little hamlet, which had been saddened by several deaths during the winter. In the fall of 1829, a Reverend William Jones at Ypsilanti preached not only at Ypsilanti, but also at Dixboro, Mallett's Creek, and Stony Creek, making his rounds on foot. Except for a Dixboro ghost episode in 1845, there was a rather dull period during the late 1930s, the 1840s, and the early 1850s. This Dixboro ghost is a story in itself. It's written up in some detail in Washtenaw history, and I don't think we'll add it to the talk this morning, but sometime you may want to read that, or I may spend the time telling you more about the story. One of the chief characters in this, a Mrs. Mulholland, was related to my grandmother, who was Eliza Mulholland, and so on. But that was about the only excitement that they had during that period of time. Land was being cleared, crops were being planted, people were being rowdy, and it was sort of a normal period prior to the Civil War. 30 years after the village was platted, the Dixboro Church had its beginning. During 1857, a protracted religious meeting was held under the leadership of Reverend Ira Donaldson of Ann Arbor. As a result, an organization was formed on December 10th, 1857, and the following trustees were elected. James Fair, I believe that was related to the Nanry family, if some of you know that family. Isaac Foster, the play that we're giving is being written by a Velma Foster, that was in that family. C.B. Cook, W.S. Waterman, D.B. Newton, H.S. Crippen. My 6th grade teacher at Dixboro School was a Miss Crippen. And an F.P. Galpin, and that family is still well evident in this area. It was proposed by this group to erect a church not to exceed in cost $2,500 and to be located within 25 rods of the public square. At about the same time, the Free Church was built about 4.5 miles east of here on the Ypsilanti and Superior town line. The Dixboro Church was 35 feet wide by 55 feet long with 20-foot posts and had a 9-foot wide vestibule with a gallery directly over it. The builder was a Mr. E.W. Ford of Saline, and the cost of $2,241 was only slightly over the authorized cost. It was interesting to note, however, that the builder finished on time. A number of persons made gifts to the church. Part of the silver communion service given by Mrs. Peter Ingalls is on display in a case at the back of the church. In November of 1859, after much discussion by the trustees and by a narrow vote, it was decided to rent pews. 32 pews were rented the first day. This practice continued into 1857 and provided revenue for the church. I never did find how much it cost to rent a pew, but anyway, it must have been somewhat nominal, but it also was a status thing, so you had your own pew, and if you were a few minutes late, you had a place to sit when you got there. Usually a minister served both Dixboro and the Free Church. Later, Dixboro was linked with the church at Cherry Hill, and at a later time, the church at Garden City. A board fence was built on the north side in 1868 at the cost of $22. In 1889, new pews replaced the early pews, which had extended from one side of the church to the other, leaving aisles only on the sides. The new pews were shorter and made possible a center aisle. Also in 1889, a new pulpit was installed at the cost of $32. The freight bill to bring this pulpit from Detroit to Dixboro was 38 cents. In 1893, a bell was installed in the steeple, and sheds for horses and buggies were built on the west side of the church. About 1920, when horses became more numerous, these sheds were torn down. I just have a vague memory of the sheds over here and stationing our old horse Topsy in them when we got here. At first, the church was heated by 2 wood stoves, which were located on either side in the back of the church. Nell Bush, an early member, recalled on her 90th birthday of attending church as a girl when the stovepipes glowed red from the roaring fires required to heat the sanctuary. The hellfire sermons, that must have been quite impressive. In the early 1920s, a part of the basement was excavated and a furnace was installed. The basement was later completely dug out and the kitchen was provided, making possible the Dixboro chicken dinners during the football seasons. That same time, the electric service came to the area and new lights were installed. This talk has provided some background up and into the 1920s. With the advent of electric power and the paving of Plymouth Road, there was a great effect on the church. But that will be a topic for another time. I wish to close with reading or two from the Superior Good News, which were published by a Reverend Condon in 1872. He decided that he needed to have a little paper put out, and to finance the paper, he had an ad put in, which read as follows. Good health is one of the blessings of this life, and everybody who can do something to promote it among his fellow men should be hailed a public benefactor. No one can doubt but what cleanliness is necessary to good health and comfort. And to promote this, Mr. E.J. Knowlton of Ann Arbor has invented and is supplying the country with his neat, handy, portable, and substantial rubber bathtub. It is nice to use in your room, both summer and winter. Just put it on 2 chairs, pour in a pail of water, and in you go. Oh, it is delightful. The price of it is only $25, which you will save in doctor's bills in a short time. So, the first ad was for a John J. Downer, M.D., physician and surgeon, residence at Dixboro, calls attended to promptly. And in reading the Chase recipe book, which some of you may have seen, I noted in there that Dr. Downer had a particularly effective remedy for burns. And it was taken up by Dr. Chase when he put out his remedy book. There's one other thing I think is kind of interesting. This particular edition was written at the time that the minister was leaving. Mr. Corden is leaving, and so he says, "We say goodbye to the many kind friends we have found here during 2 years of residence. We have encouraged seeing our congregation grow from a mere handful of persons till they have become quite large and steady. This is also true of the Sunday school. The conference will send a preacher another year who, with the hearty cooperation of the membership, will lead many of these in the Sunday school into the church. God grant it may be so. We speak a good word for the new preacher. Meet him cordially. Pray for him fervently. And the first time you shake hands with him, don't forget to leave a $1 or a $5 bill in his hands. You can do it easily. It will be worth everything to him. He will feel that he is among really sympathizing people and go right to work manfully with you." Thank you.